Autumn, 1944. Somewhere in the American Midwest, the sun hangs low over a sprawling prisoner of war camp. Rows of barbed wire glint in the morning light. Inside the mess hall, the air is thick with the scent of fresh bread, boiled potatoes, and roasted meat, aromas almost unimaginable to men who have spent months on the front lines. Scraping by on thin soup and crusts of stale bread, a group of newly arrived German POWs files in, their uniforms rumpled, faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. They clutch metal trays, eyes darting with suspicion and disbelief. At the serving line, an American cook ladles generous portions of stew, piles mashed potatoes high, and adds a thick slice of white bread. The German at the front of the line hesitates, staring at the mountain of food on his tray. He turns to his comrade, voice low and incredulous. "Are we supposed to share this for a week?" The American guard, overhearing, offers a wry smile. "That's just your lunch, pal. Dinner's at 6. The German's hands tremble as he carries his tray to the table, the reality of abundance settling in. For the first time in months, hunger is replaced by something else, astonishment, and the first fragile sense of relief. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its final, most desperate phase. The German army, once the master of blitzkrieg, was now battered and retreating on every front. Allied forces pressed in from the west, while the Soviets advanced relentlessly from the east. For German soldiers, the world had shrunk to a series of defensive lines, shattered towns, and the constant struggle to survive. Hunger was a daily companion. German supply lines, stretched thin by years of war and relentless Allied bombing, had all but collapsed. Rations grew smaller and more meager with each passing month. Soldiers on the front lines often subsisted on watery soup, black bread, and the occasional scrap of meat. Letters home spoke of gnawing hunger, of dreams filled with memories of real meals, and of the hope that the next supply truck might bring something more. For many, the end came not in a blaze of glory, but in exhaustion and surrender. As Allied armies swept across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, tens of thousands of German soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off, and forced to lay down their arms. The process was often chaotic, columns of prisoners marching through ruined villages, guarded by young American GIs, who were themselves weary from months of combat. The journey into captivity was filled with uncertainty. Rumors swirled among the prisoners. Some said the Americans would treat them well. Others whispered of harsh camps and starvation. The memory of German POW camps, where Allied prisoners had often suffered, weighed heavily on their minds. Many expected the worst. Transport to the camps was a trial in itself. Prisoners were herded onto trucks or trains, sometimes traveling for days with little food or water. The landscape changed from the war-torn fields of Europe to the vast, unfamiliar spaces of the American heartland. For many, the first glimpse of the United States was through the slats of a boxcar or the windows of a guarded bus. Endless fields, small towns, and the distant silhouettes of grain silos. Arrival at the camps brought a new kind of shock. The facilities, though surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, were orderly and clean. Barracks were basic but weatherproof, with bunks, blankets, and stoves for heat. The Red Cross was a constant presence, checking on conditions and ensuring that the Geneva Convention was observed. For men who had spent months in the mud and cold, the simple comforts of a bed and a roof were almost overwhelming. But it was the first meal that truly stunned the new arrivals. In the mess hall, American cooks served portions that seemed impossibly large: meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and even dessert. The food was plain but plentiful. For men who had grown used to hunger, the sight of a full tray was almost unbelievable. Some hesitated, unsure if they were meant to share or if it was a mistake. Others ate cautiously, half expecting the food to be taken away. The shock of abundance was not just physical, but emotional. For the first time in months, the gnawing ache of hunger was replaced by satiety, and with it, a sense of safety that had long been absent. The American guards, while firm, were not cruel. The rules were clear, but the treatment was humane. The contrast with the chaos and deprivation of the front lines could not have been more stark. As the days passed, the reality of captivity settled in. The routines of camp life, roll call, work details, mail from home brought a sense of order. But it was the food, more than anything else, that became the subject of constant conversation and quiet wonder. For many German POWs, the question lingered: how could the enemy, in the midst of war, offer such abundance? The American system for handling prisoners of war was shaped by both international law and the practical realities of a global conflict. As a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention, the United States was committed to the humane treatment of POWs. This commitment was not just a matter of policy, but a point of national pride, an opportunity to demonstrate American values. Even in the midst of total war, by 1944, the U.S. military had established a network of POW camps across the country, from the pine forests of the South to the plains of the Midwest and the deserts of the West. These camps were often located far from the front lines, in rural areas where land was plentiful and escape would be difficult. The arrival of German prisoners was a source of curiosity for local communities, but the camps themselves were models of order and efficiency. Feeding thousands of prisoners was a logistical challenge on a scale few had ever faced. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, responsible for supplying food to both American troops and POWs, drew on the vast agricultural resources of the United States. Trains and trucks delivered flour, potatoes, meat, and canned goods to the camps. Kitchens were staffed by both American personnel and trusted prisoners, who prepared meals in massive quantities: hundreds of loaves of bread, vats of stew, mountains of potatoes. The Geneva Convention required that POWs receive rations equivalent to those of the detaining power's own troops. In practice, this meant that German prisoners often ate as well as, or even better than, American soldiers in the field. The standard meal included meat or fish, potatoes or rice, vegetables, bread, and sometimes fruit or dessert. Coffee was served at breakfast, and milk was available in some camps. The portions were generous, designed to sustain men who might be assigned to labor details or farm work. For the German POWs, the contrast with their own army's rations was staggering. In the final years of the war, German soldiers had grown used to scarcity: thin soup, ersatz coffee, and bread stretched with sawdust or potato flour. The abundance of the American mess hall was almost surreal. Some prisoners, unable to believe their luck, hoarded food in their barracks, hiding bread or meat under mattresses. Others ate cautiously, expecting the rules to change or the portions to shrink. The American guards and camp administrators were aware of the shock their prisoners experienced. Some took pride in the reactions, seeing the plentiful meals as a quiet victory in the battle for hearts and minds. The Red Cross, ever vigilant, inspected kitchens and storerooms, ensuring that standards were met and that no prisoner went hungry. Reports from the camps often noted the good health and high morale of the German POWs, attributing much of it to the quality and quantity of the food. Yet the abundance was not without its complications. Some German officers worried that their men would grow soft or lose discipline in captivity. Others feared that stories of American generosity would undermine morale back home, where families struggled to find enough to eat. The Nazi regime, aware of the propaganda value, tried to suppress reports of good treatment in Allied camps, but the stories spread nonetheless, carried in letters, whispered in barracks, and remembered long after the war ended. For the Americans, The decision to feed their prisoners well was both practical and moral. Well-fed men were less likely to cause trouble, more likely to cooperate, and less vulnerable to disease. But it was also a statement, a demonstration that, even in war, there were lines that would not be crossed. As the German POWs settled into the routines of camp life, the shock of their first meal faded, replaced by a new reality. In the land of their enemy, they had found a measure of comfort and dignity that had been lost in the ruins of their own country. For the German POWs, the transition from the front lines to the American camps was a journey not just across continents, but across states of being. Hunger had been a constant companion in the final months of the war. It gnawed at their bodies, clouded their minds, and shaped every decision. The first days in captivity were marked by suspicion and disbelief. Many prisoners eyed the food with caution, half expecting it to be a trick or a temporary kindness. But as the days passed, the reality of abundance became undeniable. Meals arrived on schedule, always more than enough. The physical transformation was swift. Hollow cheeks filled out, eyes lost their haunted look, and the constant ache in their stomachs faded. Some men, overwhelmed by the sudden change, ate too quickly and fell ill, their bodies unaccustomed to such richness. Others savored every bite, eating slowly, almost reverently, as if afraid the food might vanish. Emotionally, the impact was profound. The act of eating became a ritual of recovery, a daily reminder that they had survived, that the war's cruelties could be replaced by small mercies. Conversations in the barracks often turned to food. Memories of home-cooked meals, comparisons of American and German bread, debates over the best way to stretch a portion of meat. For many, the shock of abundance was a first step toward healing, a sign that life could be more than just survival. The decision to feed German POWs well was not made lightly. The U.S. military understood that the treatment of prisoners was both a moral obligation and a matter of strategic importance. The Geneva Convention set clear standards, but American commanders saw additional benefits in exceeding them. Well-fed prisoners were less likely to resist, escape, or cause trouble. They were more cooperative during interrogations and more willing to work on labor details. Good food reduced the risk of disease outbreaks, which could threaten both prisoners and guards. The Red Cross, with its regular inspections and reports, ensured that any deviation from the standards would be quickly noticed and addressed. There was also a psychological dimension. The abundance of food in American camps stood in stark contrast to the deprivation experienced by German soldiers and civilians. It was a quiet form of propaganda, a demonstration of American capability and values. Letters from POWs describing generous meals found their way back to Germany, undermining Nazi claims of Allied brutality and sowing seeds of doubt among those still fighting. Feeding tens of thousands of prisoners required a logistical effort on a scale few had ever imagined. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps coordinated shipments of food from across the country, drawing on the vast agricultural resources of the Midwest and South. Trains delivered flour, potatoes, meat, and canned goods to depots near the camps. From there, trucks carried supplies to the kitchens, where teams of cooks, both American and trusted prisoners, prepared meals in industrial quantities. The kitchens themselves were marvels of organization. Massive ovens baked hundreds of loaves of bread each day. Steam kettles simmered vats of stew and soup. Meat was roasted, vegetables boiled, and potatoes mashed in quantities that would have fed entire villages in war-torn Europe. Sanitation was a priority, with regular inspections to prevent outbreaks of disease. Menus were planned weeks in advance, balancing nutrition, variety, and the realities of wartime rationing. While the food was plain by American standards, it was a feast to men who had grown used to scarcity. The process was efficient, but not impersonal. Cooks took pride in their work, and some even learned to prepare dishes that reminded the prisoners of home: rye bread, sauerkraut, or simple stews. The result was a system that not only met the requirements of the Geneva Convention, but exceeded the expectations of those it served. For the German POWs, the logistics of American abundance were as impressive as the meals themselves, a daily reminder of the resources and organization that had helped win the war. The leadership within American POW camps played a crucial role in shaping the daily lives of German prisoners. Camp commandants, often career officers with experience in logistics and administration, understood that discipline and order began with meeting basic needs. They enforced the Geneva Convention not only out of obligation but as a matter of professional pride. Inspections were routine, and any reports of mistreatment or ration shortfalls were swiftly investigated. American officers recognized that well-fed prisoners were easier to manage. They encouraged their staff to maintain high standards in the kitchens and to treat prisoners with a level of respect that would reflect well on the United States. The Red Cross, ever vigilant, conducted unannounced visits, checked storerooms, and interviewed prisoners about their treatment. Their reports, sent to both American and international authorities, became a record of the camp's conditions and a safeguard against abuse. German officers among the POWs faced a different challenge. Accustomed to strict discipline and scarcity, they worried that their men would lose their edge in captivity. Some tried to maintain military routines, organizing roll calls and inspections, and even rationing food within their barracks to preserve a sense of order. Others, however, saw the abundant meals as a chance for their men to recover and regain strength. Letters home from officers often described the food with a mix of gratitude and disbelief, careful not to undermine morale, but unable to hide the truth of their experience. For German soldiers, food was more than sustenance. It was a symbol of discipline, order, and national identity. The German army prided itself on efficiency, and even in the darkest days of the war, efforts were made to provide regular, if meager, rations. The sudden shift from scarcity to abundance in American camps was a cultural shock. Some prisoners initially distrusted the food, suspecting it might be a trick or a temporary gesture. Others, shaped by years of rationing and propaganda, found it difficult to accept that the enemy could be so generous. The abundance of food became a topic of constant conversation. Some men hoarded bread and meat, hiding it in their bunks out of habit. Others wrote home in coded language, trying to convey the reality of their situation without attracting the attention of censors. The shock of abundance was not just physical but psychological, a challenge to everything they had been taught about the enemy and about themselves. The decision to provide generous rations to German POWs was not without controversy. Some Americans questioned why enemy soldiers should eat so well when rationing and shortages affected civilians at home. Letters to newspapers and politicians sometimes expressed resentment, especially as news of the camps spread. Yet, military and government leaders stood firm, arguing that humane treatment was both a moral imperative and a strategic advantage. The propaganda value of American camp conditions was not lost on either side. The U.S. government quietly encouraged stories of good treatment to reach Germany, hoping to undermine Nazi propaganda and encourage surrender. The Germans, for their part, tried to suppress such stories, fearing they would weaken the resolve of soldiers still fighting. But the truth could not be contained. Letters, rumors, and returning prisoners all carried the message. In America, even the enemy was treated with dignity. For the German POWs, the experience was transformative. The shock of abundance forced them to reconsider their assumptions about the enemy, about war, and about what it meant to be human. For many, the memory of those first meals in captivity would linger long after the war ended, a reminder that, even in the midst of conflict, small mercies could change lives. Winter, 1944. The wind rattles the windows of the American POW camp, carrying with it the distant echo of a world still at war. Inside the mess hall, the atmosphere is thick with anticipation. It is lunchtime, and the line of German prisoners stretches out the door, each man clutching his metal tray, eyes fixed on the steaming pots and platters behind the counter. The cooks, a mix of American staff and trusted German kitchen workers, move with practiced efficiency. Ladles dip into vats of beef stew, spoons heap mashed potatoes onto trays, and thick slices of bread are stacked high. The portions are generous, almost extravagant by wartime standards. The aroma of real food fills the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation and the clatter of utensils. At the front of the line, a young German private hesitates. He stares at the mountain of food on his tray, then glances at the American cook, uncertain. "Are we supposed to share this for a week?" he asks, his voice barely above a whisper. The cook, used to the question by now, shakes his head with a small smile. "No, son, that's just for you. There's more where that came from." The private moves to a table, still in disbelief. Around him, other prisoners sit in small groups, some eating in silence, others laughing quietly at the absurdity of their situation. A few men, unable to shake old habits, wrap bread in napkins and slip it into their pockets for later. Others eat slowly, savoring every bite, as if afraid the food might disappear. The shock of abundance ripples through the camp. Stories spread quickly, of men who wept at their first full meal, of officers who tried to ration the food out of habit, of guards who reassured prisoners that there would be another meal, and another after that. Rumors swirl. Some say the Americans are trying to fatten them up for hard labor. Others whisper that it's all a trick. But as the days pass and the meals keep coming, skepticism gives way to acceptance, and then to gratitude. The transformation is not just physical, but psychological. The men begin to relax, to talk more freely, to rediscover a sense of dignity that had been lost in the chaos of defeat. The mess hall becomes a place of quiet community, where the shared experience of abundance bridges the gap between former enemies. The American guards, once viewed with suspicion, are now seen as protectors of a fragile peace. Letters home reflect the change. Prisoners write of the food with a mix of wonder and guilt, careful to avoid details that might be censored, but unable to hide their astonishment. "We eat better here than we did in the Wehrmacht," one man confides to his family. "I have not been hungry since I arrived." The news filters back to Germany, carried by rumor and returning prisoners, challenging the narrative of Allied cruelty and sowing seeds of doubt in a nation still gripped by war. The first meal is only the beginning. Over the weeks that follow, the German POWs adapt to their new reality. They learn the routines of camp life, the rhythms of work and rest, the small pleasures of a full stomach and a warm bed. The shock of abundance fades, replaced by a quiet appreciation for the simple mercies of food and shelter. Yet, the memory of that first meal lingers, a moment when the world shifted, when the boundaries between enemy and human being blurred, and when the promise of survival became something more, the hope of a future beyond war. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, the transformation inside the American POW camp became unmistakable. The initial disbelief that had greeted the first meals gave way to a new rhythm of life. Each day, the mess hall filled with the sound of laughter, the scrape of chairs, and the steady clatter of cutlery. The German prisoners, once gaunt and wary, now moved with more energy. Their faces filled out, their eyes lost the hollow look of hunger, and their conversations grew livelier. The abundance of food did more than restore bodies. It restored spirits. For many, the act of eating became a ritual of normalcy, a daily reassurance that the war, at least for them, was truly over. The American guards noticed the change. Discipline problems decreased, tempers cooled, and the camp settled into a routine that was almost peaceful. The Red Cross inspectors, ever watchful, noted the improvement in health and morale in their reports. "Prisoners appear well-fed and content," one wrote. with no complaints regarding rations. Stories of the food continued to circulate among the prisoners. Some men, still cautious, saved bread and meat in their lockers, unable to fully trust that the next meal would come. Others, emboldened by the steady supply, began to experiment, trading portions, sharing recipes, and even organizing small feasts for birthdays or holidays. The camp kitchen became a place of quiet innovation, where German and American cooks swapped techniques and learned from each other. On Christmas, the kitchen staff prepared a special meal: roast pork, potatoes, and apple cake. For many prisoners, it was the first time in years they had celebrated a holiday with a full stomach. The psychological impact was profound. The German officers, at first concerned that their men would grow soft, soon realized that the well-fed prisoners were more disciplined, more cooperative, and less prone to despair. The sense of dignity that came with regular, ample meals helped to rebuild the shattered morale of men who had lost everything. The mess hall became a place of community, where old hierarchies faded and new friendships formed. Outside the camp, news of the conditions began to spread. Letters from prisoners, carefully worded to avoid censorship, described the food in glowing terms. "We are treated fairly," one wrote. "There is enough to eat, and the guards are just." These letters, smuggled past German censors or shared with the Red Cross, challenged the Nazi narrative of Allied cruelty. Families back home, struggling with rationing and scarcity, could scarcely believe the stories. Some dismissed them as propaganda, while others clung to the hope that their loved ones were safe and well. The American authorities, aware of the propaganda value, quietly encouraged the positive reports. They understood that the treatment of POWs was not just a matter of policy, but a weapon in the battle for hearts and minds. The Red Cross, too, saw the camps as a model of what humane treatment could achieve, and their reports were shared with international observers. For the German POWs, the shock of abundance became a defining memory of captivity. Years later, many would recall the moment they realized they would not go hungry, that their enemy would feed them with a generosity they had not expected. The experience forced them to reconsider their assumptions about the Americans, about war, and about what it meant to be treated as a human being. As spring approached and the war in Europe neared its end, the camp remained a world apart, a place where the boundaries between enemy and ally had blurred, and where the simple act of sharing a meal had become a quiet act of reconciliation. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but for the German POWs in America, the journey was far from over. News of Germany's surrender swept through the camps, bringing a mix of relief, uncertainty, and longing for home. The routines of camp life continued: roll call, work details, and, always, the steady rhythm of meals in the mess hall. Repatriation was a slow and complex process. The U.S. government, working with the Red Cross and Allied authorities, began to organize the return of prisoners to a devastated Germany. Lists were drawn up, medical checks performed, and each man was issued a set of civilian clothes for the journey home. The camps buzzed with rumors about the conditions in Germany, about families left behind, about what awaited them beyond the barbed wire. For many, the prospect of returning home was bittersweet. Letters from Germany spoke of hunger, ruined cities, and the daily struggle to survive. Some POWs, now accustomed to regular meals and the relative comfort of camp life, dreaded the return to scarcity. Others felt guilt at their own good fortune, knowing that their families had endured years of deprivation while they had been well fed in captivity. The final meals in the American camps were marked by a sense of ceremony. Prisoners gathered in the mess hall, sharing memories and saying quiet farewells. Some took photographs, others exchanged addresses, promising to write after the war. The American cooks, who had come to know many of the prisoners by name, prepared special meals for the departing men: roast beef, fresh bread, and, when possible, a simple dessert. As the POWs boarded trains and ships for the long journey home, many carried with them more than just their belongings. They carried stories of the shock of their first meal, of the kindness of guards and cooks, of the friendships formed in unlikely circumstances. For some, the experience would become a defining memory, a reminder that even in the midst of war, there could be moments of dignity and grace. Reports from the Red Cross and American authorities documented the process. Prisoners repatriated in good health, one noted. Many expressed gratitude for the treatment received. The German government, struggling to rebuild, was slow to acknowledge the reality of American camp conditions. But the stories spread nonetheless, carried by returning soldiers and whispered in homes across a shattered nation. The abundance of food in American camps became a quiet legend, a symbol of a different kind of victory, one measured not in battles won, but in lives restored. In the years that followed, the memories of American POW camps lingered in the minds of those who had experienced them. For many former German prisoners, the shock of abundance became a story told quietly at family tables or in letters to friends. Some spoke of it with gratitude, others with a sense of disbelief that never quite faded. The contrast between the hunger of wartime Germany and the steady meals of captivity was a defining line in their personal histories. Back in Germany, the returnees faced a nation in ruins. Cities were scarred by bombing, farms struggled to recover, and food remained scarce for years after the war's end. The stories brought home by former POWs of generous portions, fresh bread, and the kindness of American cooks were met with a mix of hope and skepticism. Some families found comfort in knowing their sons and brothers had been spared the worst privations. Others, still struggling to find enough to eat, found the tales hard to believe. The American authorities and the Red Cross continued to document the legacy of the camps. Reports highlighted the low rates of illness and malnutrition among repatriated prisoners, attributing much of this to the quality of food and care provided. In the broader context of post-war recovery, these accounts became part of the narrative of American abundance, a quiet assertion of the nation's values and resources. For the former POWs, the experience left a lasting mark. Some found it difficult to adjust to the scarcity of post-war Germany, their bodies and minds still attuned to the routines of the camp. Others became advocates for reconciliation, sharing their stories as a way to bridge the divide between former enemies. A few even returned to America in later years, seeking out the places where they had been held, hoping to thank the people who had shown them unexpected kindness. The mythos of American abundance grew in the telling. It became a symbol not just of food, but of a different way of life, one where even the enemy was treated with dignity, where the rules of war could be tempered by humanity. In memoirs, interviews, and rare public testimonies, former POWs recalled the moment they realized they would not go hungry, that their captors would feed them as they fed their own. As the decades passed, the story faded from public memory, overshadowed by the larger narratives of war and reconstruction. But, for those who lived it, the shock of that first meal in an American camp remained, a quiet testament to the power of small mercies, and to the possibility of finding grace even in the darkest chapters of history. History often remembers war for its violence, its deprivation, and the suffering it inflicts on millions. Yet, within the barbed wire of American POW camps, a different story quietly unfolded. One not of conquest or defeat, but of unexpected humanity. For thousands of German prisoners, the shock of their first meal in captivity was a moment that would linger for a lifetime. It was a moment when the enemy became a host, when fear gave way to relief, and when the simple act of sharing food became a bridge across the chasm of war. The abundance of American rations was more than a logistical achievement. It was a statement of values. In a world torn apart by hatred and scarcity, the decision to feed prisoners well was both practical and profoundly moral. It demonstrated that even in the midst of conflict, there are lines that need not be crossed, and that dignity can be preserved even for those who once wore the enemy's uniform. For the German POWs, the experience was transformative. The memory of that first meal, of a tray piled high, of the disbelief and gratitude that followed, became a touchstone in the years that followed. It shaped their understanding of America, of war, and of what it means to be treated as a human being. For some, it inspired a lifelong commitment to reconciliation. For others, it remained a quiet, private memory, a reminder that mercy can be found in the most unlikely places. As the world moved on and the scars of war slowly healed, the story of American food portions in POW camps faded from public view. But its lesson endures, that the true measure of a nation is not only in its victories, but in its capacity for compassion. In the end, it is the small mercies, the unexpected meal, the shared bread, the simple kindness that leave the deepest mark on history and on the human heart.